as always, going by the order of last year's finish, which means that no surprise, we're starting with the Kansas City Chiefs here on our preview. They were 12-5 in 2021, lost in the AFC Championship game. Of course, they had that epic playoff game, cover your ears, Florio, against the Buffalo Bills. That good news did lead to a rule change when it comes to overtime. But the passing leader, no surprise, Patrick Mahomes, 4,839 yards, 37 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. He was the QB4. The rushing leader was Darrell Williams, actually, 558 yards, 6 rushing touchdowns. He was the RB20. And the receiving leader, not a surprise here either, Tyreek Hill, 111 catches, 1,239 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 6. So Tyreek Hill, one of the headliners in the offseason because he switched teams going from Kansas City to Miami. They bring in Juju Smith-Schuster. They bring in Marquez Valdez-Scantling. They draft Sky Moore. I feel like at this point, Florio, we have sort of settled on Juju being the wide receiver one, I guess, kind of the number 2 pass catcher behind Travis Kelce. I've seen his ADP rising, so I feel pretty good about where he is. So that leads me to the question, if Juju's off the board and you're looking at a Chiefs wide receiver the later parts of your draft, who would you rather have? Is it MVS in round 12 or is it Sky Moore in round 11?
Give me Sky Moore. And maybe this is just a shiny new toy, but because MVS was the starter in the first preseason game, but MVS has played his whole career with an elite quarterback, and he didn't have as much target competition in Green Bay, and he still wasn't able to really become a thing there. So I'll go with Sky Moore, who in the draft, I was really hoping this is where he landed to. I think he's a really good fit for Mahomes and the Kansas City Chief. He could help. No one can replace Tyreek Hill, but this guy will make it a little bit easier. I've been saying I think he's going to be this year's Amon-Ra St. Brown, start off slow and then really be fantasy relevant down the stretch. But Mecole Hardman got hurt in camp today, and if that is serious, that opens up an early season path for Sky Moore as well.
You mentioned the Hardman injury. He left with what is originally being called a groin injury, so that's something definitely to keep an eye on. It was a toss-up for me looking at this one. I'm going to lean toward MVS, and everything you said about him in Green Bay is 100% true, right? We tried to make him a thing after Devontae Adams. It never really happened, even with Aaron Rodgers throwing him the football. But I do wonder how many targets are going to be left over in this offense once Travis Kelce gets his, once Juju gets his. It's always been hard to find a large target share after that in Kansas City. And if they're going to be splitting these targets, I think I want the guy who has the ability to pick up yards in chunks. And for me, that's Marquez Valdez-Scantling. I do think you're going to see Sky Moore get a lot of targets, and maybe in the end, he has a slight more PPR value. I just don't think the yards are going to be there. So, like I said, it was a coin flip for me. I'm going to go MVS. I will always lean back on the standard tired trope of, hey, man, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, it's better in best ball. So I think we've got that going for him there. The other big news out of camp this year in Kansas City has been everything around Isaiah Pacheco. And first off, spelling his name has proven to be difficult. It is I-S-A-I-H, apparently. There have been multiple spellings. People are still trying to figure it out. But the one thing everybody can agree on is that the hype train has left the station for Isaiah Pacheco. The question is, are you on that hype train?
I am, and I'm also on the train that his name is hard to spell because I misspell it almost every time I type it out. But I think right now, tickets for this hype train, Marcus, are still very affordable. It's not like this guy's going in like the 6th round or something like that and you're paying a premium price. I see him still going a lot of the times like 10th or later rounds. So for me, it's definitely worth taking a shot on him in case all of this hype coming out of camp is for real. And even if he's not the lead back, we know he could potentially be in a role that is fantasy relevant. Like Darrell Williams was a backup last year for this team. There was a lot of weeks where people were starting him. So I definitely think people should be keeping a close eye on Pacheco.
I definitely think he is worth talking about in a backfield that really, for me, is sort of hard to figure out, right? We are a couple years removed from the insane Clyde Edwards-Helaire hype. He has definitely not lived up to those expectations his first few years in the National Football League. But they brought in Ronald Jones this offseason, and I really thought Rojo was going to be in a good spot there. But now here we are in mid-August, And we're talking about Rojo potentially being the odd man out because Pacheco is playing so well. But I do think when you talk about the tickets to the hype train being still affordable, I think it's also because for all the excitement about a running back in the Chiefs offense, I think we're all sort of reminded too that he was a 7th-round pick. And I also think there's only so much in way of expectation that you can put on a guy who was taken that late in the draft. We talk about draft capital and what that means for a rookie's potential prospects. So I think there's hope, and I think because the price is right, I think people are taking a swing at him. I think if you see that ADP rise, and who knows, because of the hype, maybe it does. If you start seeing Pacheco get into the 9th round, the 8th round, something like that, I'm probably out on that. But in the double-digit rounds, I definitely am willing to kind of take that swing, especially if they decide to kind of go a different direction with CEH and maybe give some targets to Pacheco. Could be kind of an interesting look. That brings us to the thing we always do here on these previews. When it comes to the Chiefs, the first player drafted, the sleeper, and the player to avoid.
First player drafted, I think, should be Travis Kelce. I'm no longer taking a tight end in round 1, like I was saying to do last season, but he goes a lot in round 2. I prefer to get my tight end in like the 3rd round if I reach up for one, but I still think Travis Kelce should be the first Chiefs and the first tight end off the board this year. Sleeper, we've already spoke about Sky Moore and Pacheco, so I'm going to go with Clyde Edwards-Helaire here. I know a lot of people have soured on him, but this is his first offseason where he's fully healthy and having a normal offseason. Like his rookie year was COVID, so there was no preseason. Then last year he was dealing with some injuries and off the field stuff. So for me, I still think there's a little bit of reason to get excited for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and he's cheaper than ever in drafts. Player to avoid, Marcus, this one might hurt a little bit, but it's Ronald Jones. Like when he signed, he was getting some hype potentially. Could he steal the job away from Clyde Edwards-Helaire? Now the talk is he even going to make the roster? Pacheco has seemed to leapfrog him and really take that role away from him. Ronald Jones' ADP has been falling in recent, like the last couple of weeks, but there's no way I would want him on my roster right now.
Yeah, I would say I'll go. Obviously, the first pick is Travis Kelce. Especially with Tyreek Hill not there anymore, Kelce is going to occupy a huge target share, so he's easily the first Chief off the board. My sleeper, you talk about Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I'm going to actually go with Jerick McKinnon, who played well for them down the stretch last year, and for all the hype about Isaiah Pacheco, he is still a little bit down on the depth chart. I can see a role for McKinnon where they come in, they throw him the football. Really, one of his downsides has just been health, but if he can stay healthy, I think he catches the football effectively. We know he's got incredible speed and can be a game breaker. So again, the draft price is such that you are not putting out a lot of draft capital. The risk is low versus what the potential reward is in an offense that still should be very dynamic and score a lot of points this year. And my player to avoid, I'm with you. As much as it hurts, it is Ronald Jones. I mean, we're talking about a guy who went from being, it looked like on paper, a great fit in this offense to a guy who might be looking for a job in the very near future. Side note to that, though, I do think, if Ronald Jones ends up as a free agent, I do think somebody's going to give him an opportunity somewhere. It'll be curious to see where, because that's going to have an impact on what his fantasy value can be. But as for now, with what's going on in Kansas City, I think it's probably best to take a pass on Rojo and see what his future holds there. The 2021 season for the Las Vegas Raiders might be one of the more chaotic seasons in memory for a football team. They finished 10-7, made it to the playoffs, but that doesn't tell the full story. I mean, this was a team that went through incredible turmoil. John Gruden resigned at some point during the season. Henry Ruggs was involved in a tragic accident, and he's no longer in the NFL because of that. There was just so many ups and downs with this team. They rallied late in the season to finally get into the playoffs. It was just an incredible year all the way around, both good and bad for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now they turn the page, a very different looking team heading into 2022. But a quick look back at last season, their passing leader, Derek Carr, 4,804 yards, 23 touchdowns, 14 picks. He's the QB 13. Josh Jacobs, the leading rusher, 872 yards, 9 rushing touchdowns. He finishes as the RB12. And the receiving leader, Hunter Renfrow, 103 catches, 1,038 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns. That made him the wide receiver 10. But back to Josh Jacobs. This is a guy who was never quite turned into the fantasy back we wanted, or the guy that we thought he could be. He's never really been involved in the passing game and is generally underwhelmed. This year, Florio, people seem to be off the Josh Jacobs train. His ADP definitely not very high for a guy of his stature. Where are you comfortable taking him this year?
Yeah, I'm one of the people who are lower on Josh Jacobs. I'm comfortable taking him in like the 5th round, around there. The reason I'm lower on Josh Jacobs is last year he didn't even rush for 900 yards, but he finished as an RB1 because he caught a bunch of passes. But like you said, last year was such a weird year for them. They missed so many of their pieces in the passing game that I think that was he was a benefactor of that. I don't expect him to get anywhere near the amount of targets he had now that Davante Adams and such are there. So for me, and then there's concerns like he was playing in the Hall of Fame game. Like, what's going on? So I'm definitely a little bit lower on Josh Jacobs than others.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, he played quite a few snaps in the Hall of Fame game, which had everybody a little bit baffled, especially when we knew Derek Carr, Davante Adams, Hunter Renfrow, Darren Waller, those guys weren't going to see anything close to any sort of action, but Josh Jacobs was out there. You talk about him finishing as an RB1 because of the passes he caught, and he didn't really catch that many passes. And you take that away, you take away any chance of him really, I don't know, like maybe he'll get some goal line work, but there's a guy named Zamir White who's getting a lot of buzz right now, who could be taking some opportunities away from him. So I might be willing to kind of take that 4th round reach on him, but that would be it for Josh Jacobs this year. And it's definitely disappointing and frustrating because I think when he was drafted, we had higher expectations for him. So we'll see what happens, but he very much is at best a low end RB2, I think right now, just based on kind of what this offense can be. You mentioned Davante Adams is there. He's going to get plenty of opportunity. He's going to catch the football, and what few targets that might have been there for Davante Adams, or for Josh Jacobs, I should say, rather, probably going to go somewhere else. But speaking of Davante Adams, we know he's probably going to be the target leader. I mean, you're talking about arguably the best wide receiver in football. He's back playing with his old quarterback from Fresno State. So he is going to be fine. I'm not worried about Davante Adams. The question, though, who eats after him? Darren Waller has been one of the target leaders on this team the last few years. Hunter Renfrow, as I mentioned earlier, was the receiving leader on this team last season. By nature, it seems like one of these guys is going to get fewer opportunities. Who's the guy who maybe kind of keeps himself afloat? Who's going to eat after Davante Adams? Is it Waller or is it Renfrow?
I think it's Darren Waller. Waller is such a mismatch at that tight end position, especially now when you factor in, like, there was times last year where teams were bracketing him, throwing 2-3 defenders his way. You're not going to be able to do that now with Davante Adams there. In fact, he's going to get more one-on-one coverage than ever before, I think, and that is a scary, scary sight. So I'm still high on Darren Waller, but I'm pretty low on Hunter Renfrow, who I think is a good NFL player, but I definitely think was propped up last year because of circumstances.
I definitely think Hunter Renfrow doesn't get to 100 catches if everybody is there and healthy all season long. He's one of those guys who he's, I think, the new poster child for PPR. If you are one of those people who doesn't like full point PPR, it's me. I'm people. Hunter Renfrow's that guy who sort of drives you crazy. 103 catches for just over 1,000 yards. So I don't know that the same target share is going to be there for him this year. And if he's not catching the ball downfield, if he's not getting in the end zone, it's going to be hard for him to get back to being a top 10 receiver like he was last year. Darren Waller still does a lot for this offense. He can still get downfield. He can still be a playmaker. So I think he is the clear-cut number 2 option in the passing game there in Las Vegas after Davante Adams. All right, so now that we've gotten through that, here we go. First player drafted. Who is your sleeper, and who's your player to avoid for the Raiders?
First player drafted, Davante Adams. I know he's still not with Green Bay, but he is still an elite receiver. Sleeper, I think Derek Carr. Like you said it earlier, Marcus, he finishes the QB 13 last year. That's about where he's getting drafted now. And he did that last year with just Hunter Renfrow for some games. Now he's going to have Adams, Waller, Renfrow, the running, a whole bunch more pieces. So I think he's being drafted at his floor, and it's because quarterback is so deep. But he's a really good quarterback you could take when you get a little bit later in your draft. Player to avoid, I don't really have much of Hunter Renfrow at all this year because I think he's going to be more useful for the Raiders in real life than he will be for fantasy, because he is someone who needs to rack up a lot of catches. He's not a field stretcher or anything like that. So I have a lot of volume concerns for him. So I haven't really targeted Hunter Renfrow.
Yeah, Devontae Adams easily the first pick off the board for the Raiders. You're talking probably late first round, early second round. I've seen a lot of Devontae Adams kind of around the turn in a lot of drafts, so I think that's going to continue. For me, my sleeper, and this is maybe a deeper sleeper, and I mentioned him briefly, Zamir White is getting a lot of attention right now in that Raider offense. Listed second on the depth chart there behind Josh Jacobs, but people love his pass catching ability. I think that can help sort of keep him afloat, and I'm curious to see how much standalone value he may have. If he's catching the football, maybe it helps out a little bit, but certainly if Jacobs is hurt, or if they decide they just sort of want to transition away from Josh Jacobs, I think Zamir White could be in line for some opportunities. For me, the player to avoid, it's a toss-up. It's probably Hunter Renfrow, although Josh Jacobs probably kind of slots in there too, just because at the point where Josh Jacobs is coming off the board, there are some other guys, probably some wide receivers that I'm a lot more interested in. So I don't know that I have a lot of Josh Jacobs on rosters this year, just because I just don't like what the production could be. And I feel like I can get better production, even if it's at a wide receiver spot, from somewhere else. So he's a guy that I'm kind of staying away from here at this point. I got to ask you real quick, though. Darren Waller, I mean, this is a guy who has been a top five, still is a top five tight end. Where in that top five, with Kelsey and Pitts and Kittle and et cetera, where do you have Waller right now?
I have him fourth. I have it Kelsey, Andrews, Pitts, Waller, Kittle. But I will fully admit, I think after the big three, there's a little bit of a drop off because there's more uncertainty there. And if you want to put Kittle ahead of Waller, I'm not going to argue that.
That's kind of what I've got. I've got the same. I've got the Andrews first, Kelsey second, Pitts third, and then I go Kittle and Waller 5. So he's still a top 5 tight end for me. I just have him there at 5 because, look, man, you paid Devontae Adams a lot of money. You're going to throw him the football is kind of the way I look at it there. The LA Chargers next up on our AFC West preview, the team that everybody is looking for to take that big leap forward. They just missed the playoffs last year, finished at 9-8. All they needed was a tie in that last week with the Raiders, and the Raiders said, no, we're not going to cooperate. We're just going to go on and win it, and we're going to go to the playoffs. We're going to leave the Chargers sitting at home. But plenty of optimism around the Lightning Bolts heading into 2022. But in 21, Justin Herbert was your LA Charger passing leader, 5,014 yards, 38 touchdowns, 15 picks. He was your QB2 behind only Josh Allen. Your rushing leader, Austin Eckler, 911 yards, 12 rushing touchdowns. He was the RB2. It's, of course, because he caught a whole lot of passes there. So that's kind of what gets left off in that little rushing analysis there. The receiving leader, yardage-wise, it was Mike Williams, 76 catches, 1,146 yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 12. Keenan Allen was your receptions leader with 106. He finishes just 8 yards behind Williams, but just 6 touchdowns. But he was the wide receiver 11. That means it's time for Going Strong, presented by Castrol Edge. And it brings me to Mike Williams specifically. And I guess you could sort of face him off head to head against Keenan Allen, because last year, Florio, was that breakout year from Williams that we have been waiting for a while. And you started to see his ADP sort of reflect what people expect for him coming into this season. I know that Allen is being drafted ahead of him, and I am fully on board with that. I endorse it. I have drafted Allen ahead of Williams plenty of times, but kind of looking at this, because of the yardage numbers, because he's more of a downfield threat, his average depth of target is going to be deeper, and the touchdown upside appears to be higher. Could you make a case that Mike Williams is actually the Chargers receiver that you want?
I definitely could make that case, because Keenan Allen's numbers, his metrics have been declining the last couple of years, as well as he just ages. But I have Keenan Allen ranked just ahead of Mike Williams because I think he is safer. I think he's more of the floor play, but I think Mike Williams has the more upside. He's the ceiling option here because, like you said, he's the field stretcher. He's the one they're going to look for in the red zone. So while I think Allen is a little bit safer just because of who he is and his style of play, I certainly think Mike Williams is the home run swing play.
What Allen has going on his behalf is all the receptions, the targets, the receptions. I mean, you can pretty much pencil him in for 100 catches, 1,100 yards, and 6 to 8 touchdowns. But beyond that, I mean, anything else metrics-wise just seems to sort of tilt toward Mike Williams a little bit. I'll say this. I was in a standard mock, a non-PPR mock draft, and was surprised to see Keenan Allen go a round and a half, almost 2 full rounds ahead of Mike Williams. In a PPR draft, I completely understand that. In a non-PPR draft, I was surprised that there was so much separation between those two guys. So, and their ADPs being what they are, for folks who want to just wait a little bit, try to get that value and get production that could be similar, these guys finished back to back in terms of fantasy scoring last year, and you can wait another round or two to get Mike Williams in drafts. So maybe he is the guy that you are sort of keeping an eye on. Should be interesting, though. Should be another big year. We want as much of this Chargers passing game as we can get, and Mike Williams very much kind of had that breakout season that we had been waiting for. So earlier in the show, we talked about Isaiah Pacheco in Kansas City. I got another Isaiah that is generating a lot of buzz right now, and that is Isaiah Spiller as the backup potentially to Austin Eckler, although recent headlines say that maybe that's not the case. But Isaiah Spiller still getting drafted a lot late in a lot of fantasy drafts. So I asked if you were on the Isaiah Pacheco hype train. I'm going to ask, have you bought a ticket for the Isaiah Spiller hype train?
I mean, get the arms pumping, Marcus. I am on this hype train again. Isaiah Spiller was a running back that, for me, in this year's NFL draft, I thought he was the third best running back after Ken Walker and Breece Hall. But he fell a little bit. I think the Chargers was a great landing spot for him because last year we saw the Chargers backup running backs get like 150 touches. Every year they're searching for a number 2 running back since Melvin Gordon left. It was Josh Kelly, Larry Roundtree, Justin Jackson. Nothing stuck. I think Isaiah Spiller is better than all of those guys. I think he could have some weekly standalone value as Eckler's backup, but knock on wood, I hope not. You know I love Eckler. If anything happens to him, Isaiah Spiller becomes an automatic RB2 with more upside.
So the recent reports are, and this is within the last day or so, is that at least in camp, Joshua Kelly seems to be separating himself from Isaiah Spiller as the potential backup to Austin Eckler. That's a little bit worrisome if you're spending capital on Spiller. I know I still see him going in the double-digit rounds. No one's expecting him to have a ton of standalone value, but people are sort of using him as a way to hedge against any sort of Austin Eckler concerns. What I will say, though, is if these reports are true about Kelly really taking over in that as the number 2 in that backfield, that almost makes me feel more confident about Austin Eckler because you mentioned the laundry list of running backs who have been slated to be the number 2 there, who really never gained any traction behind Eckler. Joshua Kelly was in that list, and if he's the guy who's the number 2 right now, any thought of reducing Austin Eckler's workload seems to kind of go out the window, because why would the Chargers turn around and give a whole bunch of touches to a back who really wasn't able to perform? So I say that this is a roundabout way of saying any Joshua Kelly rumors make Austin Eckler, I think, a bit of a stronger early round selection for me. But I think going back to the fact that, as I like to say, we always like the shiny new things. Isaiah Spiller is that. So I still endorse you taking that dart throw at him late in the draft, just because we know what the Josh Kelly movie looks like. We know how it ends. Let's see if maybe Spiller can be something a little bit different here for the Chargers this year. All right, same question as always, though. First Charger off the board, who's a sleeper, and who's the guy you're staying away from?
First Charger off the board, Austin Eckler. He should be a top 5 pick this year automatically, I think. Sleeper, Gerald Everett. Look, maybe it's me. I can't quit Gerald Everett. I see him play. I see him make these flashes that he shows us, and I'm like, this guy's good. He's athletic. They need to get him the ball more. And we saw Jared Cook be fantasy relevant with the Chargers last year. I think Gerald Everett could even surpass that. Player to avoid, this might be cheating, Marcus. This is the one team in the league. I don't think there's a single player I would avoid. Like, I'm in on Herbert. I'm in on Eckler, Spiller. I'm in on the receivers, even like Palmer in the later rounds, Gerald Everett. It's a cop-out, but I'm totally on board with everyone on this Chargers team, and they're my pick to win this division and go to the AFC Championship game.
So obviously Austin Eckler is the first pick off the board. I mean, we're talking about him possibly being drafted in the top three in a lot of situations. So it's going to be hard to beat that. My sleeper, you sort of mentioned him there briefly, is Josh Palmer. I was frustrated over the weekend at the Kings Classic because I missed out on him a couple of times when I had him sort of on my radar. But uh, I have not been shy about my love for Van Jefferson with the Rams, and I think Josh Palmer can sort of be that with the Chargers. Not a guy that is going to be huge on a week-to-week basis, but is going to have his moments during the season. Can be a nice flex play, especially if you're in deeper leagues. There, like I said, we want as many parts of the Chargers offense as we can possibly get, and Josh Palmer, I think, is going to have a nice little piece of it. So I'm gonna follow your cop out though and say, really, I think the Chiefs or the Chargers to avoid are the guys that we don't really know their names, the guys that are going to be well down the depth chart. So I mean, yeah, you're not, I don't know, you're not drafting Donald Parham, right? You're not drafting a guy like Jalen Guyton or somebody like that. So all of the principles in this offense, Allen and Williams and Eckler and Palmer, Herbert, all of those guys, you're all drafting them, and it's just about finding the right spot. If you're not drafting a Charger, it's because that guy's probably not getting on the field a whole lot. So I think that's probably the fair way to talk about it. And it's going to be interesting that we still have one more team to talk about, but this division is going to be just a slugfest on a weekly basis. By the way, and I don't remember who it was, but somebody brought up the point too. We want players on teams that are going to score a lot of points, and with the offenses in this division, you're going to have to score a lot of points on a week-to-week basis to win. So I think that makes a lot of guys in the AFC West really, really valuable fantasy options in 2022. Maybe one of the more intriguing fantasy-related squads for this year is the Denver Broncos. Let's go back and look at them last year. First, 7-10, missed the playoffs in 2021. Their passing leader was Teddy Bridgewater, just over 3,000 yards, 18 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, QB 23. Melvin Gordon was the rushing leader, 918 yards on the ground, 8 rushing touchdowns. He was the RB 21. Receiving leader was Cortland Sutton, 107 catches, 776 yards, a couple of receiving touchdowns, wide receiver 44. Obviously, change is afoot in Denver. The most notable change being that Russell Wilson is now the starting quarterback. Drew Lock was shipped off to Seattle as part of that deal there. A lot of things that have people excited about this offense. The one thing that has vexed me this entire offseason, and we've talked about this before, but I feel like we have to keep bringing it up because it still sort of confuses me. Javonte Williams still has a pretty high second-round ADP. Made sense to me when Melvin Gordon was potentially a free agent and maybe moving on. Doesn't make sense to me now. I need, Florio, for you to help me understand why it is that his ADP has not taken the fall that I thought it would.
I'm with you. I thought it should have gone down. I think it's just the upside. Like, I still think if anything happens to Melvin Gordon, that Javonte Williams has the upside of being the best running back in fantasy football. And I think a lot of the times people just get enamored with upside and they're like, hey, it might stink early on, but if it hits, I'm going to be in a great spot. So that's the only real reason I could think of.
I know people love his ability to force missed tackles and broken tackles, and that is really, really great. I think the best case scenario you can hope for this year is a 60-40 split in that backfield. I don't even know that you get that. Last year, it was pretty even between the two of them. I think Williams had a slight edge in snap share. When I say slight edge, I mean like 51-49. I don't see the workload being enough to justify where you're taking Javonte Williams, especially when you've got, say, a guy like Aaron Jones still on the board, Saquon Barkley, who we talked about earlier in this show, maybe even Ezekiel Elliott. I don't know that the ADP fits with what I think his role is going to be this year. So this has been one of the biggest head scratchers to me all off season long. It's why I think I bring this up and hammer it at every time I see Javonte Williams' name pop up here. I raise my hand sheepishly and say, "Can we talk about Javonte Williams ADP?" Like I'm sure I've made people sick to death about it, but I don't know. I need an answer to this mystery. I don't know. Mentioned Russell Wilson now in town. He has brought with him a whole lot of optimism. He's also brought this whole like Broncos country, let's ride. thing with him, which I don't know how I feel about it. It's almost become a parody of itself now, but that's neither here nor there. What does have me excited, though, is what this means for a guy like Courtland Sutton. I look at this as you're taking the guy who was the deep threat, the downfield field stretcher for the Broncos, and you were pairing him with the guy who throws one of the best deep balls in the NFL. I'm sort of setting you up to make me feel really happy and special about this. But for you, what is Courtland Sutton's ceiling this year?
I think his ceiling is being, I think like a high-end wide receiver 2. Others will say being like a smash wide receiver 1. The Courtland Sutton, the people who are in on Courtland Sutton point to that 2019 season and ignore everything else that's happened since then. I think he is high upside, but I'm like sitting here like, all right, if you're gonna give me a discount on Jerry Jeudy, I'm gonna keep gobbling up Jerry Jeudy.
I don't know if I'm flashing back to that 2019 season for Courtland Sutton. I just think the one thing that was holding this offense back was quarterback play. And if we wanted Sutton to be great, we wanted Jeudy to be great. And just with the inconsistency of Drew Lock, with Teddy Bridgewater sort of being Teddy Bridgewater, it sort of held this offense back a little bit. So I'm just excited about what this potentially could mean for Courtland Sutton. Again, I think he's a guy who can pick up yardage in chunks. I think he's going to get plenty of targets. And look, if you believe the reports that right now, whenever things break down, whenever Russell Wilson has to move off the spot, they say he's looking in Courtland Sutton's direction. So as I am reading the preseason tea leaves and maybe allowing my priors and my inherent biases to kind of cloud my judgment here, I'm looking at Courtland Sutton. I don't think he's a smash wide receiver 1, by the way. I think he's a fringe wide receiver 1. I think that's sort of his ceiling there. I think you're talking, 10, 11, 12, somewhere like that. But man, I'm fine with that because I'm drafting him as a second wide receiver most of the time anyway. So if I can get that wide receiver 1 upside there, I feel pretty good about it. All right. First player drafted, sleeper, player to avoid in Denver.
First player drafted, it has been Javonte Williams. I still think it should be him, but I think it should be lower cost than what it is. Sleeper, KJ Hamler, because Tim Patrick last year was really good in that third wide receiver role for the Broncos, and then he has a season-ending injury now in training camp. So KJ Hamler, someone who could take the top off the defense, I think he is a sleeper to keep an eye on here. Player to avoid, it's one we spoke about a lot, Marcus. I just have not been drafting Javonte Williams at ADP. As much as I love him and his talent, as great as I think he is and as excited as I was for him at the end of last season, they brought back Melvin Gordon. So I continue to let other people draft Javonte Williams, but getting Melvin Gordon in like the 8th round, something like that, I've taken him in a couple of drafts.
Well, we are aligned in our first player drafted and our player to avoid because Javonte should be the first player off the board, just not where people are taking him. And I'm staying away from him because of where people are taking him. And I'm just not comfortable doing that. For me, my sleeper, though, I have been on the Albert Okwuegbunam train all off season long. I think Albert O really has a chance to step up and play well this year. I keep saying there's a reason we kept trying to make Will Dissly a thing in Seattle for all those years, that Russell Wilson was getting him the football, especially down near the goal line. The only real concern that I have with Albert O is that he was not drafted by this current regime. And there are reports that they do really like Greg Dulcich, the rookie out of UCLA. But I just think Albert O is incredibly athletic. I think if they can get him in space, give him the football, let him go out and make plays, I think he has a really big season ahead of him. And again, I'm not drafting him as my first tight end. I'm drafting him sort of as a depth add, a guy who could potentially flash. The ADP still very much in the double digits. So I'm definitely a fan of Albert O this season and hoping. Look, man, I mean, we talk about this all the time, Florio, with tight ends. Like you could take a handful of names, throw them up in the air, and they'll come down in any order. But I just feel like the draft price is right on Albert O. I feel good about this one.
I'm with you. We know Russell Wilson loves targeting his tight ends, especially in the red zone. So sign me up.